In the age before the Imperium became a cathedral of endless war, before humanity learned to worship survival more than truth, there was a single figure moving through the long darkness of history with a patience no mortal empire could match. He had walked among tribes, kingdoms, tyrants, and collapsing civilizations for thousands of years, unseen or misunderstood, always watching humanity rise, fracture, and destroy itself. While nations burned and species vanished into dust, he endured. He was not merely a ruler waiting for his throne. He was a design unfolding across millennia, a will so vast that ordinary history could barely contain it. And when old Earth finally collapsed into techno-barbarism, gene war, he decided that waiting was over. Humanity would be united, or it would perish. Terra at the end of Old Night was not a cradle. It was a graveyard pretending to be a world. Its oceans were gone or toxic. Its skies were wounded by ancient industry and forgotten weapons. Warlords ruled from mountain fortresses built over the bones of nations whose names were no longer remembered. Mutants haunted the wastelands. Cults fed on ignorance. Lost technologies became objects of terror and prayer. Human beings, once heirs to the stars, had become prisoners of their own shattered inheritance. And into that broken world the Emperor stepped openly at last, not as philosopher or hidden guardian, but as conqueror. He did not ask Terra to unite. He forced it to remember what unity meant. To do that, he forged weapons worthy of the age. The Thunder Warriors were the first great monsters of his rebirth, brutal genre-crafted giants made for one purpose alone: to break the back of old Earth's tyrants. They were not elegant, and they were not built to last. They were thunder given flesh, unstable and overwhelming. A living storm unleashed against barbarians who had inherited the arsenals of dead civilizations. Where they marched, kingdoms ended. Fortress walls split apart. Empires that had survived centuries vanished in nights of blood and fire. Beside them marched the first armies of unity, disciplined, relentless, and guided by a master who seemed less like a king than the inevitable return of order itself. One by one, the warlords of Terra fell. Some resisted in arrogance. Some bargained. Some claimed ancient rights or divine mandate. None of it mattered. The Emperor was not fighting for a throne among others. He was destroying the idea that mankind should remain divided. The Unification Wars were not noble in the way later generations liked to pretend. They were savage, exterminatory, and often merciless. Entire armies were erased. Bioengineered horrors were burned out of underground kingdoms. John cults were hunted into extinction. Every victory tightened the Emperor's grip on a planet that had forgotten discipline, science, and collective purpose. He did not rebuild Terra through kindness. He rebuilt it through certainty. But conquest alone was never enough for him. He did not seek only to dominate the present. He intended to seize the future itself. While his armies fought across Terra, the Emperor gathered knowledge, secured laboratories, reclaimed forbidden sciences, and prepared the next phase of his design. He understood something no ordinary ruler could comprehend. If humanity was ever to rise again, it would need more than soldiers and territory. It would need engineered greatness. It would need generals, symbols, demigods. It would need beings strong enough to command worlds and loyal enough, he believed, to build an empire larger than any one lifetime. So he turned his unmatched genius toward the most ambitious creation project in human history. The Primarchs were born in secret, not as ordinary sons but as living masterpieces of genetic and psychic engineering. Each was crafted to embody an aspect of the Emperor's own power and purpose. They were made to be conquerors, lawmakers, visionaries, warriors, and rulers. Around them he built the legions Astartes, the Space Marines, transhuman armies shaped from lesser but still terrifying stock. If the Thunder Warriors had won Terra through brute force, the Primarchs and Astartes would win the galaxy through permanence. This was not merely empire building. This was species-level redesign. Humanity would not stumble back to the stars as it once had. It would march under a master plan enforced by superhuman will. Then disaster struck. Before the Primarchs could be raised by the Emperor's own hand, they were scattered through the warp by powers that understood exactly how dangerous they would become. Hurled across the galaxy to different worlds, each Primarch was shaped by different cultures, wars, and wounds. Some were raised by kings, some by monsters, some by desert tribes, gladiator pits, or haunted fortress worlds. The Emperor had designed demigods, but the galaxy itself finished their education. In later ages, many would say this scattering was the first true victory of chaos in the war for mankind's soul. It ensured that when father and sons were reunited, they would not return as blank heirs to a perfect vision. They would return as legends already scarred by fate. Yet the Emperor did not abandon the project. With Terra largely unified, he turned outward. The Treaty of Mars brought the Mechanicum into alliance, joining the industrial might of the Red Planet to the newborn Imperium. The solar system was brought to heel. Fleets were forged. Warp travel became organized once more. And then the Great Crusade began. It was the largest reconquest campaign humanity had ever attempted, a galaxy-spanning storm intended to reclaim lost colonies, destroy Xenos threats, crush renegade human states, and bind all human worlds beneath one rational, secular order. The Emperor called this vision the Imperial Truth. No gods, no superstition, no división. Only mankind enlightened and united, marching toward destiny. As the Crusade advanced, the Emperor rediscovered the Primarchs one by one. Each reunion changed the Imperium. Horus, charismatic and brilliant, became his most beloved son. Lemon Russ was a savage executioner with absolute loyalty. Rogel Dorn embodied discipline and fortress-like resolve. Robout Guilliman brought order and statecraft on an imperial scale. Sanguinius, radiant and noble, seemed almost too perfect for the brutal galaxy he inhabited. Magnus the Red wielded psychic power on a scale few could understand. Lorgor burned with spiritual intensity. Angron carried chains no power could remove. Fulgrim pursued perfection until it began to hollow him out from within. Every Primarch was magnificent. Every Primarch was dangerous. And together they gave the Great Crusade the momentum of myth. For a time, the dream worked. Worlds long cut off from Terra were reunited. Alien empires were crushed. Human civilization expanded with astonishing speed beneath banners carried by giants. The Primarchs did not merely conquer, they inspired. They were living proof that the Imperium was more than another temporary regime. Under them, humanity looked unstoppable. The Emperor stood at the center of it all as architect, father, warlord, and future maker. Yet his very greatness concealed the flaw that would one day destroy everything. He built loyalty through awe, but not always trust through honesty. He demanded obedience on a scale no being had ever demanded before, while keeping his deepest motives hidden. The Empire grew stronger. So did the silence inside it. No son stood closer to the Emperor than Horus. First found, most trusted and beloved by nearly all who served beside him, Horus became the natural heart of the Crusade. He understood both war and men. He could speak to generals, warriors, diplomats, and poets with equal ease. Where other Primarchs inspired dread or reverence, Horus inspired devotion. So when the Emperor at last chose to withdraw from the Crusade and return to Terra for secret work beneath the Imperial Palace, he did the unthinkable. He named Horus Warmaster, supreme commander of the Imperium's armies, first among brothers, second only to the Emperor himself. It was the highest honor imaginable. It was also the moment the balance between father and sons began to fail. Because once the Emperor left, questions multiplied. Why abandon the Crusade at its height? Why retreat into secrecy while sons and legions still bled across the stars? Why empower human administrators, iterators, and bureaucrats over warriors who had conquered worlds by force of will and blood? Some Primarchs accepted the change. Others resented it. Horus felt its weight most of all. He was now responsible for holding together a galaxy-spanning war machine built around a father who no longer explained himself. Victory after victory began to feel strangely empty. He was no longer merely leading the Crusade. He was inheriting its contradictions. Meanwhile, another brother carried humiliation like a hidden blade. Lorgar had once loved the Emperor too much. He had worshipped him openly, building faith in temples in the name of a father who preached that gods were lies. The Emperor answered that devotion with public punishment, forcing Lorgar to watch the destruction of Monarchia, the perfect city raised in his honor. It was meant as correction. It became spiritual mutilation. Lorgar did not stop seeking truth. He simply turned elsewhere. In the warp he found powers that accepted worship, powers eager to speak of divinity, destiny, suffering, and cosmic meaning. Where the Emperor denied the language of faith, chaos embraced it. and Lorgor, wounded and zealous, chose to become missionary to damnation. The fall of Horus began on Davin, but its roots reached much deeper. By then he was already tired, burdened, uncertain, and quietly surrounded by men and influences working against him. When he was struck by a warp-poisoned blade and brought near death, the moment of weakness finally came. Through ritual, vision, and deception, Chaos showed him a future that was horrifying precisely because it was partly true. He saw the Emperor worshipped as a god despite every denial. He saw a future Imperium of ignorance, cruelty, endless sacrifice, and spiritual slavery. He saw statues missing his name, loyalty unrewarded, sons discarded after service. It was not the full truth, but it was enough. Chaos did not need to invent all of Horus' fears. It only needed to arrange them into a story he could no longer resist. When Horus rose from that experience, he was not a different man all at once. That is what makes his fall so devastating. He remained intelligent, persuasive, affectionate, and outwardly disciplined. But at his core, something had shifted. He no longer saw himself as servant of the Emperor's design. He saw himself as the only being capable of saving humanity from the Emperor's hidden betrayal. Pride, love, fear, resentment, and manipulation fused into a new certainty. The War Master would rebel, not as a mad beast, but as a son convinced that overthrowing his father was an act of grim necessity. From there, the galaxy began to break. Horus gathered brothers to his cause, each for reasons that reflected wounds already present. Fulgrim fell through vanity and obsession, Pacharabo through bitterness and long-nursed grievance, Angron through unhealed rage, Mortarion through resentment and distrust, Conrad Kurz through fatalism, Lorgor through devotion to darker gods, Alfarius and Omegon through motives so secret they remain debated even now. Magnus would be drawn toward disaster by tragedy and arrogance. Some fell easily, some slowly. But once Horus began to weave them together, the rebellion ceased being rumor and became machinery. The war for mankind's soul had entered its second phase. The first great act of open treachery came on Istvan III. There Horus purged loyalists from within his own ranks by sending them to the surface under false orders, then virus-bombing the planet. Brothers died, still insisting there had to be some mistake. Captains who had served the War Master faithfully realized too late that loyalty was now a death sentence. The massacre was horrifying not only because of the scale, but because of what it revealed. The old bonds were dead. Trust itself had become a weapon. The heresy would not be a clean split between armies. It would be a plague moving through kinship, command structures, and memory. Worse followed on Istvan V, the drop site massacre. Loyalist legions answered the call to suppress Horus, believing reinforcements would arrive behind them. Instead, those reinforcements revealed themselves as traitors at the decisive moment. The result was slaughter on a mythic scale. Ferrus Manus died. The Salamanders and Raven Guard were shattered. Loyal Hope took a wound from which it never truly recovered. The Imperium had not simply lost battles, it had lost certainty. From that point onward, every distress call, every order, every alliance carried the possibility of betrayal. Elsewhere, other catastrophes unfolded. Magnus, trying to warn the Emperor of Horus' treachery through forbidden psychic means, shattered the wards protecting the Emperor's secret webway project beneath Terra. What he intended as salvation became disaster. Demons poured toward a gate the Emperor had planned to use as humanity's safe passage beyond reliance on warp travel. The Emperor was forced to remain on Terra to contain that breach, locking himself to the Golden Throne long before it became the machine of his endless suffering. Magnus' warning was true. His method was ruinous. That contradiction defined so much of the heresy. Even good intentions became disasters once pride guided them. Then came Prospero. Lemon Russ and the Space Wolves were sent against Magnus. Whether the order was originally meant as arrest or destruction matters little now. The result was annihilation. A world of learning and psychic mastery burned. Magnus, wounded in body and soul, gave himself to powers he had long believed he could control. Another son was lost, not simply because he turned away from the Emperor, but because the Emperor's empire no longer knew how to correct error without escalating it into catastrophe. The dream was eating its own children, and while traitors advanced and loyalists bled, the Emperor remained on Terra, almost immobile at the center of a crisis he could not publicly explain. That silence shaped everything. To his defenders, he was sacrificing everything to hold shut a disaster no one else could contain. To many of his enemies, it looked like withdrawal, secrecy, and manipulation. Both views held pieces of truth. He had always believed himself capable of bearing unbearable burdens alone. During the heresy, that instinct became fatal. The father of mankind could still see farther than others. He could not be everywhere. At last, the scale of the species he intended to master became larger than even he could control through vision and force alone. As the war spread, Sanguinius resisted corruption at Cygnus and emerged as the noblest symbol the Loyalists possessed. Guilliman fought to preserve order in Ultramar, while the Shadow Crusade transformed whole systems into ritual slaughter grounds. The Khan chose loyalty over isolation. Rogaldorn reshaped Terra into the greatest fortress in human history. The Lion hunted in secrecy. Vulcan endured horrors that should have erased any lesser being. Corax became a shadow of vengeance. Everywhere, shattered greatness tried to hold back incoming night. The Imperium did not survive the heresy because it was pure. It survived because enough loyal souls, human and transhuman alike, refused to let betrayal define the species without resistance. Eventually, the war narrowed toward a single destination. Horus no longer needed to conquer every world. He needed Terra. He needed the Emperor dead. That would be enough. The Siege of Terra became the final concentration of everything the Great Crusade had built and everything the heresy had corrupted. Traitor fleets blackened the void around the throne world. Demons bled into reality. Pachirabo's siegecraft crashed against Dorn's defenses in battles so vast they became less like wars and more like geological events. Titans walked. Space Marine legions drowned each other in blood. Civilians died by the billions. The air of humanity's homeworld became smoke, ash, prayer, and panic. Still, Terra held. Not because it was unbreakable, but because there was nowhere left to fall back to. Sanguinius became a living miracle on the walls. The Khan struck like a storm through impossible odds. Malcador carried responsibilities that would have destroyed almost any other mind. And the Emperor, trapped upon the Golden Throne, continued to hold shut the webway breach while war devoured his empire above. Even in defense, his victory demanded impossible sacrifice. That is the essence of the Imperium he created. Survival always costs more than anyone can bear. It is simply demanded anyway. By now, Horus was barely just Horus. The powers of chaos had flooded him with strength, insight, arrogance, and rot. He remained brilliant enough to lead, but his humanity was dissolving inside a storm of divine corruption. He had begun the rebellion believing he could seize destiny. In the end, destiny consumed him as thoroughly as any slave. He was still the War Master. He was also the instrument of gods who hated one another but agreed that humanity's hope must be strangled on Terra. Then came the final challenge. With loyalist reinforcements approaching the solar system, Horus lowered the shields of his flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, and baited the Emperor into direct confrontation. It was a trap, but also an admission that time was running out. Terra could not endure forever. The Emperor gathered a strike force and teleported aboard with Sanguinius, Rogaldorn, and chosen warriors. Inside the flagship, reality itself had been warped into a maze of madness and symbolism. Corridors twisted, time fractured. The ship had become a shrine to rebellion and corruption. The boarding force was scattered. Each warrior faced nightmare alone. Sanguinius reached Horus first. Noble, weary, and luminous to the last, he confronted the brother whose fall had doomed the species. Perhaps he hoped some fragment of Horus remained. Perhaps he simply knew that if anyone was going to stand between the Emperor and the War Master, it had to be him. He died there. The angel was broken by the son who had once been most loved. It was not simply a murder. It was the symbolic end of any remaining innocence inside the Imperium. If Sanguinius could fall, then the age of greatness had truly ended. Then the Emperor entered the final chamber. Father and son faced each other across the ruins of everything they had built. Horus stood empowered by gods. The Emperor stood exhausted by duty, secrecy, and the collapse of his grand design. Yet he was still the most formidable being in human history. Their duel was more than physical combat. It was the judgment of an age. Warp power, psychic force, divine ambition, grief, and history collided in a struggle ordinary minds could only describe in fragments. At first, the Emperor held back. Whether from love or regret, he could not instantly destroy the son he had cherished. That hesitation nearly doomed everything, because by then Horus was no longer redeemable. The Emperor finally understood that whatever remained of his son was buried beneath corruption too complete to reverse. So he did the unthinkable. He unleashed his full power and annihilated Horus utterly, body and soul, leaving nothing for chaos to reclaim. It was victory, but only in the bleakest sense. The Emperor had saved humanity from immediate extinction by killing the brightest of his sons and destroying the future he had once imagined for them both. The war ended not with triumph, but with irreversible mutilation. Mortally wounded by the duel, the Emperor was carried back to Terra and placed upon the Golden Throne. From that moment onward, the machine became not merely a psychic interface or hidden instrument of the Webway project, but a life support system, prison, beacon, and altar. The Emperor did not truly live. He did not fully die. He endured in a state that mirrored the Imperium itself, majestic, crippled, worshipped, decaying, and sustained only through constant sacrifice. The imperial truth died with him. In its place rose the imperial cult. The man who had forbidden religion became a god because the broken civilization he left behind could no longer understand him any other way. That is the final tragedy of the Emperor of mankind. He conquered Terra, unified the species, forged demigod sons, launched the Great Crusade, and built the greatest empire humanity had ever known. Yet almost every instrument he used to secure the future also contained the seed of ruin. His secrecy alienated his sons. His ambition outpaced trust. His intolerance for spiritual language drove some toward darker faiths rather than away from belief itself. His refusal to share burdens made him appear invincible right up until the moment that illusion collapsed. He was too great to be ordinary, too flawed to be divine, and too necessary to be allowed either death or forgiveness. Even now, 10,000 years later, the Imperium survives in his shadow. Every starship guided through the warp depends on the Astronomicon, lit by his suffering. Every cathedral, crusade, purge, and sacrifice speaks his name in forms he never intended. Billions pray to him daily, and perhaps some part of him hears. Or perhaps the corpse on the throne is now something stranger than emperor, god, or man. His dream of reason became an empire of ritual. His project to liberate humanity from superstition created the greatest religion in human history. His attempt to forge unity through power locked mankind into an age where power became the only language left. And yet, without him, humanity might have vanished long ago. That is why he remains so compelling. He is not simply hero or tyrant, savior or failure. He is all of them at once, the impossible center of a civilization that cannot live up to his vision yet cannot survive without the ruins of it. He built an empire to outlast chaos, and in trying to do so, helped create the conditions for its greatest triumph. He raised sons to conquer the galaxy, and through them plunged it into the war that would define 10,000 years of suffering. He sought to lead mankind into a rational future, and instead became the silent god of a dying age. So when we speak of the Emperor of mankind, we are speaking not only of one man, no matter how immortal or magnificent. We are speaking of the single will that tried to drag an entire species into destiny by force. We are speaking of the greatest architect in human history and the father of its deepest wound. We are speaking of terror reborn in fire, of Primarchs scattered to the stars, of crusades, betrayals, walls of the imperial palace shaking under bombardment, and a golden throne that became the most terrible seat in all fiction. We are speaking of a being who almost saved humanity, almost doomed it, and in the end became the eternal symbol of both. That is the Emperor's story. Not a clean rise and fall, but a long procession of impossible victories paid for by hidden damage. A man who tried to become the future before humanity was ready to follow. A ruler who demanded unity yet inspired myth. A father who created giants and lost them. A conqueror who mastered the world and still could not master the hearts of his sons. A corpse that became a god. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, his dream still burns broken, distorted, sacred, and unfinished.